Sure. I want to move things in another direction because the event that we're doing here was kind of presented as a why I am a Christian / why I'm not. And so instead of just discussing the claims as to why you are a Christian, I want to discuss some of the ideas as to why I'm not. And many of those involve moral cases, which I'm sure you've spoken about ad nauseum before, but perhaps we can rehash it. I want to ask what might seem a very silly or frivolous question, but it's not. And I don't want you to try and clarify this with questions like, is it really God? How could I know? Presuming we could know that it was God. Presuming we could know that that's the voice you're hearing. If God asked you to shoot up a primary school, would you do so?
I don't actually answer hypothetical questions of that nature, and there's a reason for that, because I don't believe that is consistent with God's character, so I don't believe that in principle God would ask me to do that, so I don't answer hypothetical questions like that.
I think a better reason to not answer that question is because whichever way you answer it, it demonstrates something wrong with the position that you're holding.
Okay, elaborate on why you say that.
If you say that you would, then it demonstrates that a religion like Christianity can drive people to do some fairly immoral things, and I doubt that you would say that you would do that. But if you say that you wouldn't, then you claim that there's some kind of moral standard that exists outside of God.
So I believe that God is just and God is good. And so I believe that everything that God instructs or commands is consistent with his character, which I don't believe shooting a school would be.
Well, how do you understand what justice is?
So I believe that there's two primary sources for our concept of morality and justice, which is number one is that God has inscribed a moral law in our hearts. So when Moses comes down the Mount Sinai with his tablets and the Ten Commandments, the people of Israel didn't say, oh gosh, I didn't realize you weren't to commit adultery or kill people, right? No, they had already this moral law inscribed in their hearts because we bear the imago Dei, the image of God. Secondly, we have, of course, the scriptures as well.
On the first point, I think that actually there is an element of people not immediately having the moral code in their heart. For instance, when my brother realized that his homosexuality is not in line with Christianity, I think that he would have had a question like, really, I'm not supposed to do that. I don't think it's as straightforward, and if it were as straightforward as just having the moral code onto our heart, then we wouldn't need the scriptural revelation of morality in the same sense. But if your conception of justice is based in God, then you can at least imagine a scenario in which God asks you to do something which goes against what you originally believed to be his moral character.
Right.
You could be, you surely must admit that you could be wrong about your conception of what justice is and what God's goodness really means. And what I'm asking you is that if God commanded you to do something which contradicts your understanding of good, but you know must be in line with God's understanding of good, would you do it?
Right, so there's a biblical precedent for this paradox, which, as you know, is Genesis 22, where Abraham is instructed by God to take his son Isaac and take him to the region of Moriah, one of the mountains that he would tell him about, and there sacrifice him as an offering unto the Lord. And Abraham knows that God has banked or has placed the promises of the nation of Israel and the salvation of the Gentiles on this son Isaac. And so it seems very strange that now God's asking him to go and kill this son on Mount Moriah. And so, of course, you know the story. They got Mount Moriah, and at the top there's a deliverance, there's a ram provided, and there's a great substitution made for Isaac. And Hebrews makes the point that Hebrews 11 makes the point that Abraham believed that God would raise Isaac from the dead, even if he had taken his life, because Abraham trusted that God really had placed the promises of his covenant on Isaac. So I don't think God would ever ask me to do that outside of that framework, if that makes sense.
Yeah, it's a different story though, because of course God didn't actually want Abraham to sacrifice his son. He just wanted to show his willingness to do so.
Yeah, exactly.
I don't know if you had children, what would you do in his position?
So I don't believe that it would be consistent with God's character.
Well,
to ask
let me put it simply. I'd say no.
Mm-hmm. So I don't answer hypothetical questions of that nature.
Right.
Because you're asking about counterfactuals, where the world could have been, and I prefer to talk about what we actually have evidence for and what the facts are.
Right, but the reason I'm asking you this is because there are things within the moral code of Christianity that I find objectionable, and so I don't understand how I can be expected to throw caution to the wind and follow that doctrine regardless if you wouldn't be willing to do the same.
Again, I don't think that this is consistent with God's character, so I don't believe that he would ever ask such a thing. And also, when we're dealing with epistemology, like how do we know that God really has spoken in this way? That would be a very high bar. And so how do I know that I'm not just hearing voices, for example?
Well, let's make it easy then. Yeah. Let's take claims in the Bible that are palpably immoral by a modern moral standard. And I don't know if you're a moral objectivist, but if you are, then that means that moral claims are true regardless of their cultural context. How do you account for instance, at the very least, lack of condemnation for slavery and at worst advocacy for it in the Bible?
So do you consider slavery immoral?
Yes.
But you're a moral subjectivist?
Depends what you mean by moral subjectivist. And now you're doing a Muhammad hijab on me. That would be
okay, so I'm going to address the question, but first I want clarity on this.
That would be a tu-quoque fallacy, which is just to say you as well, which is just to sort of say that it's hypocritical to make a claim like that. Look, I'm not the one who's claiming moral objectivity here. Okay. You're claiming that there is moral objectivity. Okay. You claim that the source of that moral objectivity has provided certain ethical codes, and so you're the one who has to justify that they sit together.
Okay, so you wouldn't say slavery is wrong then? You just say that, in my opinion, I don't like it. Is that correct?
No, I would say that it is wrong with reference. So the subjectivity of morality doesn't lie at the level of the action, it lies at the level of the motive. I'm a psychological utilitarian. I think that all action is motivated by desire, and the only thing that's desired is pleasure, but I think that there are objective derivatives you can take from that. I know for a fact, or I can't know for a fact in certain instances, but at least in principle there are objective facts to be known about how to achieve that end goal. So when I say that something's wrong, what I mean is that that is not the best way to achieve the shared end goal. But in that sense, I can say that it is wrong, yes.
Okay, so let's move on then to actually address the question on slavery. Repeat the way you worded your question again on slavery.
Well, I can't remember, but something along the line, because it was the reason I was asking you about the case analogous to Abraham, which is that there are certain things in the Christian doctrine, and if you want to know why I'm not a Christian, one of the reasons for that is because I can't throw my weight behind a doctrine that fails so utterly to condemn one of the worst atrocities in human history.
Okay. You know that there is condemnation of slave trading in Scripture?
Yes.
Right, okay.
So it's about, like I say, there are things that are condemned and there are things that are condoned in the Bible, but when we get down to the specificity, so for instance, you could talk about in the New Testament where it says that the slaver or some phrase like that is not going to make it to heaven. Well, okay, but that's quite broad. You go into the book of Exodus and you find very specific examples of how to treat individuals who are in what might be called voluntary servitude. Right. Now, the Bible might not call that slavery, or it might call it slavery but mean voluntary servitude, but by today's standard, we certainly consider it to be, at the very least, immoral and at the very worst slavery.
Yeah, so there's a lot of context on the topic of slavery, and often we tend to retroject our understanding of kind of North American slave trade into the biblical text, and we have to understand the concept of slavery in its own context. And I know you've done a lot of videos on this, which I have watched, so I'm aware of your material on this. But in terms of Hebrew slavery, it was something that was when someone it was often a voluntary way of paying off debt. So if you entered into debt and you couldn't pay it, then you could volunteer yourself into slavery as a way of paying off debt. You're familiar with that? I'm sure.
So let's take that as the context in which we're working in. So it's a kind of voluntary debt payment agreement. It's like an employee-employer kind of contract situation. So imagine that we're in such a situation in the modern age. It's a voluntary servitude, just like having a job, for instance, where you're not paid but you're given somewhere to live or something like that. And then you take an actual quote, such as from Exodus 21. Anyone who beats their male or female slaves with a rod must be punished. Good start. If the slave dies as a direct result, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two, since the slave is their property. Two problems. First is that even if it's a voluntary servitude contract, I don't think it's ever permissible to allow the person in charge of that contract to mercilessly beat a slave as long as they don't die. If they get up after a few days and everything's fine. Secondly, referring to them as their slave, as their property, is not the most enticing of prospects.
Right. So this is in Exodus 21. But so the argument is that so is it permissible then for a slave master to beat his slave to the point of death within a strike of death, and then he gets away with it? Basically, that's the moral objection that's made. But when you look at the context of this text in Exodus 21, we see that it goes on to say, when a man strikes the eye of his slave, male or female, and destroys it, he shall let the slave go free because of his eye. If he knocks out the tooth of his slave, male or female, he shall let the slave go free because of his tooth. I don't think it's literally talking about eyes and teeth, but it's making a more general point that if someone is abusing his slave and beating him such that he's causing bodily harm, then there's punishment for that the slave gets to go free, the guy's going to lose his...
Well, that can't be the case if in the verse that I quoted, we're talking specifically about beating a slave with a rod, and it doesn't just say, I'll remind you, that this slave shall only be punished if they die. It says the slave will be punished if they die, but they are not to be punished if the slave recovers after a day or two. Recovery implies physical injury, and not to be punished implies that they are not to be punished. Now, there may be exceptions to that, but the point of the matter is that if you think it's okay in any context, and you can say like that the verses you quoted are making a more general point, well, who are you to decide what's making a general point and what's making a specific point? And again, I would stress that since slavery is so obviously a moral abomination, why would it be so unclear? If God is not the author of confusion, then God can't be the author of these passages.
So slavery in the North American, 19th century sense certainly is an abomination. But the slavery in the biblical sense, at least in the Hebrew sense, is I think it has a lot of context which we can get into.
Well, let's do so.
Yeah,
I've been waiting. I mean, look,
yeah.
I think that it's also about 18th century American slavery was horrendous. So is any version of slavery in any context, in any point in history, which allows the slave master to beat their slave with a rod. Surely you must agree with this.
There is a form of discipline in slavery, yes, but the context makes it clear that they were not supposed to produce permanent bodily harm.
I'm not asking you to describe slavery, I'm asking you to offer a moral judgment upon it. Do you think it's morally permissible for anybody, even if it is a voluntary service contract, to beat their slave with a rod and specifically not be punished if they get up after recovering after a few days, recovery implying that they have been physically harmed?
But you understand the point that I'm making, that they were not supposed to cause permanent bodily harm.
Even so, and I still don't know if that is entirely reliable, because you could just as easily make the case that they were talking specifically about the bodily parts you're mentioning because they're particularly important to certain areas of life. Even if it was just somebody's arm being broken, I still think that that's morally indefensible.
Yeah, I would say that would be morally indefensible, which is why they would lose the slave if they caused permanent bodily harm, such as someone's arm being broken.
But they are not to be punished if the slave gets up after recovering from the beating with a rod.
The word punish there in Hebrew means punishment by death. So they get the death penalty. If they kill the slave, they get the death penalty.
Okay, what about Numbers 31?
Yeah.
I don't want to run out of time here. I'm sure you're familiar. Actually, I don't know where we are on time.
About 30 seconds.
Okay,
yeah.
we'll try it for 30 seconds. Numbers 31, of course, in fact, I'll just quote it. Moses instructs the following they're attacking the Midianites and essentially committing a genocide against the Midianites. And Moses instructs his combatants, now kill all the boys and kill every woman who has slept with a man, but save for yourselves every girl who has never slept with a man. Now, I'm not entirely sure what a bunch of aggressive males could want with a bunch of virgin girls. I'll leave that up to the imagination of the audience. But to me, this seems not just slavery in terms of like a voluntary service contract. This seems a fairly grotesque form of sexual slavery being quite clearly advocated here. Even in the course of war, I don't think that's acceptable.
1 minute to respond.
Okay, so this is in number 31, and so on the issue of the killing, so there's a whole range of moral arguments that we need to get into on genocide.
I understand. Yeah. So
and on whether it's always wrong to kill innocent people, for example.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm not convinced that it's always wrong to kill innocent people.
And me neither. But it's always wrong to keep them the same.
And I also think, in terms of killing innocent people, I think it's difficult to make moral judgments on an omniscient being who has access to things that can happen in the future as consequences.
Right. Maybe we could just put it up to a divine mystery why the moral creator of the universe would allow people to take sex slaves, but I don't think that's really convincing me.
Yeah, I confess I do struggle with this text, so I don't know the answer to that question. But I think it's one of the more difficult.
I'm glad, because I've seen so many people try to defend it. I really like that answer. But what I would say is that what we're discussing here is why I'm not a Christian and why you are a Christian. The reason I'm not is because, like you, I look at texts like this, I'm confused by them at the very least, and I turn to people for answers. They can't be found. What we are left with is having to throw our hands up in the sky and saying, maybe the author of morality can permit sexual slavery, and that's just not good enough for me.
So you, I'll just make one final statement. You do have a good point on this text, that it is difficult to understand what's going on here. So I fully admit that. Yeah.